Alright, this is Multicultural Dimensions in Group Work. Topic is Issues of Disability. This presentation was completed by Rachel, Crystalline, and Emily. Broader issues for this group. Those with disabilities have a history of falling victim to internalizing public stereotypes and being discriminated against. Some people within this community may have been taught that being disabled meant being less than. Studies have shown that those with disabilities are perceived more negatively by employers than those without disabilities. This population is extremely underrepresented, and people with physical disabilities have been described as dependent, incompetent, unemployable, and isolated from society. Specific issues with group work and natural ways this population organizes in groups. Communication barriers within the group setting. Disabled patients could require sign language, written instructions, and various other communication options. They could also not have any communication restrictions. There are limited personnel who are trained to work with this population in a group session. Specific interactions are required while working with this population. They are a minority group, meaning their preferred way of interacting with others could be easily overlooked. One way those with physical disabilities would gather would be during workshops that could show them how to do different skills that they themselves may not have deemed possible. Members would band together to fight for their rights. Hartley and Goodrich acknowledge in their article that while the populations of people with disabilities is among some of the fastest growing minority groups, literature addressing group work for people with disabilities is limited. Common misconceptions about disabilities are often the result of ableism, which Hartley and Goodrich define as the perceived inferiority of people with disabilities and preference for able-bodiedness. Having a disability was historically used as a reason to remove an individual's rights, particularly those of populations commonly faced with discrimination, such as African Americans, immigrants, and women. Hartley and Goodrich recognized the experience of rehabilitation counselors in working with individuals with disabilities in a counseling setting, including group work. Association for Specialists in Group Work and the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association have collaborated in an effort to improve the competence of counselors who provide group therapy to individuals with disabilities. Hartley and Goodrich discuss the ARCA-endorsed disability-related counseling competencies and identified two standards specifically relevant to group work. 1. Consider various factors, time since diagnosis and cognitive capacity when screening persons with disabilities for inclusion in group counseling. The second one, ask about and provide accommodations as necessary for the effective delivery of individual and group counseling services to persons with disabilities. Hartley and Goodrich also note that knowledge about cultural identities among persons with disabilities is also very important. For example, many people who are deaf do not view their condition as a disability. Rather, it is their cultural identity, among others. Finally, it was recommended that all group work should be supervised. This will ensure biases are addressed and kept separate from the group, increases the foundation and skills, and improves intentional practice. In the book Group Work with Persons with Disabilities, an entire chapter is dedicated to exercises and resources that could be helpful for persons with disabilities. It is noted at the beginning that facilitators must be mindful of the participants in the group and be sure to modify exercises as needed in order to be accommodating. It's also noted that these specific exercises are very easily modified to fit any need. The first example I included is called Who Am I? The goal is meant to increase awareness of the self. Members are simply given a list of incomplete sentences numbered 1 through 10. Each sentence begins with the statement, I am, followed by a blank. The second exercise is called Autobiography. The goal is to gain important information without focusing on the past or forcing the group to focus on the past. Members are asked to either write their autobiography in 5 sentences, they can be asked to list titles of chapters of their life if it were a book, or even draw a roadmap of their lives. Is a list of best practices specific for working with clients who are deaf. Um, some of them note importance of maintaining eye contact, being warm and direct, being mindful of limitations to lip reading by providing additional visual elements such as gestures, notes, and lots of visual aids. It's also noted, another important one is noted to avoid multitasking during a session. So if you commonly take notes while you're working with the client, try to avoid that, and so you're able to just give the client your full attention. And also use simple language, and it also mentions to be willing to give the client more time. So just know that and acknowledge the fact that it takes a little bit more time to accommodate them, and be willing to give them that time. Some ethical issues with this population are listed below. People with physical disabilities tend to be looked down on, ignored, and discriminated against. It is not uncommon for people with disabilities to be denied education or excluded from employment. Sometimes they are subjected to violence and other forms of abuse. Often, but not only in poor countries, their needs for food and shelter are not met. For more practice-related issues, an example of a practice-related issue in this area, Chapter 5 of our textbook shares an experience of a client who is deaf, in his or her experience in a group setting. The client reports that from the initial meeting with the facilitator seemed very put off by the client's desire to participate in the group, and even surprised that he or she wanted to participate. This attitude continued in the group setting, and the client was excluded from activities and not even acknowledged. This attitude caused the client not to return to the group. The fact that the obvious was ignored, this client needed them to recognize that he or she was blind and acknowledge them, and they didn't get that. And that's unfortunately something that seems to happen a lot in the group setting. Just a quick note about the NASW Code of Ethics. Ethical standard, cultural awareness, and social diversity does include mental or physical ability. This seems to be really important, especially for situations such as individuals who are part of the deaf community. Often they don't even consider themselves to have a disability, whereas they seem to fall under that umbrella. But it would be something important for a social worker who is working with a deaf client to know this, so that they don't offend them, and that they can be respectful and culturally aware.